Hi there guys, got a video here for you today on the BSA R10, and what we're going to be doing in this one is just showing you how we fitted this FT rail to the top of the rifle. And this job here is being done for a good friend of mine, and that's Jim from the Crawley Surplus store. So what he done is supply me with this rail and ask me to fit it to this gun. The rail normally comes fitted with an 11mm dovetail in the bottom, whereas the R10 uses a 13mm dovetail on the top. So all we needed to do was machine the dovetail out in order to get it to fit. And I'm happy to say it fits on the top of the rifle really quite nicely, and then can be secured into place using our 4mm Allen key. And there we have it. That's the FT rail fitted to the top of the R10. Some people are going to love it, other people are going to hate it, but I quite like it if I'm honest. And what this little rail here does is just open you up to a wide number of mounting options. The original 13mm dovetail is really quite limited, but Picatinny mounts are everywhere, so everything should fit on this. But there we have it. So what I'll do now is take you over to the mill and show you how we got the work done. Right then, so here we are over at the mill, and the first thing we need to do is get our female Picatinny rail jig set up in the vise. This part here is something that I made quite a few years ago now, but it's come in handy on various projects throughout the channel and in the various airgun projects I've done personally. It allows us to hold a Picatinny rail nice and securely in the mill vise and gives us access to the rear face of the Picatinny rail. So we're just getting that put into the vise, tap down nice and lightly with a soft face hammer, and then we can come through and just clean the piece out, making sure that there's no debris in there before we put our Picatinny rail in. And here we have our Picatinny rail. Now if you look closely, you'll see a number of spacers already installed into the rail. These spacers will just help take some of the ring out of the part. Obviously the piece is split down the middle, and if we were to cut the dovetail in the top there with no support between the two pieces, the part may ring as we cut it. So we've got a couple of spacers there, then a bolt running through the middle, just clamping lightly onto the spacers. And then we can get that installed into our jig, just using the 6 securing bolts to hold that in place nice and carefully. The next thing we have to do is run an indicator across the top of the part to make sure it's nice and level with the mill. And as you can see here, there's quite a lot of discrepancy from the back and the front pillars. This is because the part has around 20 MOA built into the rail already. So we need to match that on the mill by just adjusting the angle of the actual jig itself. To do that, all we're going to be doing is just angling up the jig slightly, indicating along the top edge, and then tapping it into position. If you wanted to get really precise, you could use something like a screw jack, and that would allow you to fine-tune the position without having to sort of tap the piece into position. But I'm quite happy to just spend a little bit of time tapping the jig into its final position. And then, as you can see there, after a few adjustments back and forward, the part is running nice and level. Now I did check all the faces, so the top faces of the dovetail, and they're all running nice and level. Once the jig's in position, the next thing we can do is use an edge finder to find the center of the rail. To use one of these edge finders, it's nice and simple. All you do is feed in the Y direction until the edge finder wobbles off center. That indicates that you're 3mm from the edge that you're trying to find. Once we have one side done, we can move over to the other side, find the edge once more, and then use the half function on our DRO to find the center of the piece. With the Picatinny rail all set up in the vise, the next thing we can do is start work on milling out the profile of the dovetail. To begin with, we're using a 10mm end mill to mill out the rough depth of the dovetail, which on the BSA R10 is around 3mm. And we're doing this with just our 10mm end mill, just taking nice light passes until we reach the depth that we require. Once we're at our final depth, we can start milling out the rough width of the dovetail. Now we're milling the minor width of the dovetail, so the smallest point on the BSA R10. I measured this off camera to be about 11.5mm, so we need to step over 0.75mm in the Y direction, and that'll mill the slot out to around 11.5mm. With the rough profile milled out, the next thing we can do is come back with our dovetail cutter and start work on the actual dovetail itself. We're using a 1/2 inch dovetail cutter, so the cut width will be around 12.7 millimeters. The first pass with the dovetail cutter establishes both the sides of the dovetail and also the base, so the final depth of the dovetail. The first cut is the most difficult, as the dovetail cutter is pretty much cutting on all sides of the cutter. But we're just taking it nice and slowly, using plenty of WD-40 as a cutting oil, and getting through the pieces nice and carefully. With the first pass complete, the next thing we can do is start milling the dovetail out to its final width. Now we measured this to be around 13 millimeters on the BSA R10, so the cutter itself is 12.7 millimeters, and we need to widen the slot to 13 millimeters. We're going to be shooting for 13.1 millimeters, and that little bit of clearance will just make sure everything slides together nice and freely. As this is a clamp style design, we don't want the dovetail milled in this piece to be super tight on the actual block of the rifle. We want a little bit of clearance there, and that will just make sure that the rail comes off nice and easily when we loosen the bolts. To get the dovetail to the final width, what we're doing is concentrating on one end at a time, stepping over about 0.15 millimeters, roughing out one side, then doing the same on the other side, then moving to the rear section and doing the same on this section here. Once both ends have been roughed out, what we can do then is take our final pass across one side at a time. So we're milling both the back and the front section of the dovetail in one pass. With that all done, the dovetail profile is pretty much complete. The last thing we have to do is raise the cutter up and then start milling the sides once more. If we look at the R10 block, we can measure that the height of the dovetail is 3 millimeters. However, the widest point of the dovetail is around 2 millimeters high. There's a bit of clearance between the top of the dovetail and the widest point. We need to mimic this in the female profile, and to do this, all we need to do is raise the cutter up slightly and start cutting along the sides again. Again, it all sounds a lot more complicated than it actually is, but what we're effectively doing is moving the dovetail up in order to match the profile on the R10 block. So we're just moving the cutter up about 0.2 millimeters at a time until we reach that 1 millimeter mark. Once we're there, we can test fit the block in the dovetail and then make any adjustments we need to in order to get the block to fit as we want it to. And once that's done, we can test fit the block into the Picatinny rail. It's a little tricky to get started, but once it's started, it slides in there nicely with very little play between the block and the rail. So I'm really happy with how that come out. With that all said, we'll take you back over to the bench and I'll get you one final shot of it. Right then, and there we have it. So there's the rail fitted to the R10, and it looks quite nice in my opinion. Some people are going to love it, other people are going to hate it, but all that really matters is that Jim got what he asked for. So the rail itself fits on there really quite nicely. It's not like a super precision fit, but I didn't want it to be too tight on the rail there. As this is a clamp design, I was a little worried that over time the metal may crimp onto the dovetail, and then when you loosen the bolts it may be a little stiff to get off. So I just gave it a little extra clearance so that it slides on and off nice and easily. And as you saw when we installed the rail, you don't have to do the screws up mega tight, you just need to nip them up and they clamp on the rail quite nicely. But there we have it, that's pretty much going to do it for this particular video, so thank you very much for watching. I hope it's been interesting, and we'll see you in the next one.